Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Heff.
I'm Forrest.
And we have got to talk about some fun stuff. We're talking about super cookies. We're going to do our best Cookie Monster impression. Cookie, cookie, cookie. And we are going to talk about helping you with your voice assistant devices, getting some privacy back in your life on those devices. And we've got to talk about the water treatment hack, along with some real creativity with Morse code and phishing attacks in Morse code. Please join us. So, Forrest, a lot of creativity with our threat actors in the news lately.
Yeah, definitely. Creativity is very important when it comes to problem solving, and a lot of actors have a lot of problems to solve.
So I think today we're going to talk a lot about some of the unique stuff that's been going on in terms of just the type of attack vectors and using things like Morse code. And we're going to talk a little bit about super cookies here in just a moment, and favicons and those kind of things. So let's get right into it with Telegram. Do you happen to know anything about this Telegram thing that's going on?
Yeah. So looked into it a bit, and it looks like one of the libraries that Telegram is using for how they handle stickers, like the little animated images that you can post in your chats, appears to have a vulnerability. So it pretty interesting stuff when people are looking for these kinds of avenues to exploit these fun features that a lot of people want to have in their applications.
Yeah, the issues with Telegram, and if any of you use Telegram, you just need to be aware of it. There is an update that's been released. This actually happened back in September and October, but it's just recently been really getting in the news. And like Forrest said, it's specifically tied to one sticker in particular. I really think, Forrest, that the creativity for infiltrating an animated GIF or any kind of sticker that's used in any of these chat programs is really brilliant.
Yeah, it's pretty elusive, you're looking for some very obscure methods of exploitation, but the more feature rich that these chat programs get, the more of these kind of library dependencies they're gonna have. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the stage fright, the Android vulnerability that was in some of their media processing libraries. So definitely not unprecedented, but it's not usually somewhere that you would look for a security vulnerability off the bat.
Yeah, and in particular with the Telegram exploit and the flaw here, what you're seeing is the threat actor could potentially send you a malicious sticker, and they could use that malicious sticker then to bypass and get into accessing your photos, your videos, and your chats. So again, if you're using Telegram, you need to update the app. The other one that came to the news this past week that was been really all over the web too is if anyone uses the Share It app, and there's a security bug in the Share It app. It's targeting Android users, so it's not so much impacting anyone from the iOS and that code base. But what I found interesting, Forrest, is that there were security researchers that found this bug in the Share It app. They notified Share It, and Share It just sat on the information. They didn't do anything with it.
Yeah, complete radio silence. It was pretty frustrating to see that was the response, or rather the lack thereof. It really flies in the face of what we view as a responsible response. Uh, and just, I mean, you compare this with, for instance, like FireEye. When they released everything that they had for detecting their own breach, really going above and beyond. So it's quite the contrast between those types of responses, where you see one taking full ownership and doing as much as they can to secure their users, and then on the flip side, just them completely clamming up and not saying anything to anyone, not looking to collaborate, or it's just pretty shameful.
Yeah, and this particular with the shared app, there's over 1 billion people for us that have downloaded this app. And if you're out there and you're one of the users of this, you got to be aware of it. That there is some vulnerabilities in this app, and the developer of it has been notified, and yet they're choosing not to, repair it, and that sucks, especially for the folks that are using this app in a corporate environment. All right, so again, we're going to switch gears. We're talking about creativity of the hackers and the threat actor world that's out there. And the one story, Forrest, that really knocked my socks off this week was this whole phishing using Morse code. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty funny. I mean, obfuscation is definitely, kind of a bread and butter thing when it comes to malicious software, but just seeing this one reminded me of, some of the capture the flag challenges that I would do. I felt like I was at DEF CON.
And now we got to whip out our ham radio license, and we got to remember how to do Morse code at ham radio. So the whole deal with this Morse code thing is you get a phishing email, and there's an invoice attached to it, and when you open it up, you'll see a lot of texts, and the text will actually do a call function to a Morse code, and then it has to get decoded. And that's where the interesting part of this attack happens, is that you get this invoice and you're wondering how come it has all these weird characters in there, and if you're not aware what the characters are, then you have no clue that this is actually a phishing attack and there's something nefarious going on here.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that a lot of these are geared towards pretty emails, and we want to have live content, JavaScript, and that sort of thing. And it's plain text is best. You can't really hide much there if you're just going with plain text email. But for that beautification, that functionality, there does come kind of an increased surface. So it's just a balance of usability and security, I guess.
We're coming full circle for us, right? 1800s meets the 1900s meets the 2000s now, man, with this this Morse code attack. But real creative. I mean, I have to give it to them. This is some fancy stuff. All right, let's talk now. This is the fun stuff about cybersecurity and understanding the creativity of threat actors. And this one is it's been around a long time for us. Talking about Supercookies.
Yeah, this stuff has been, it's been advertisers and others have been trying to find ways of tracking users, across devices, across sessions, for years now. I mean, heck, Verizon got slapped by the FCC with a lawsuit back in 2016, right?
Right. But these cookies, though, I guess a lot of folks, they have a love-hate relationship with cookies, depending on what side of the coin you're on. If you're on the advertiser side, you love cookies. But a lot of browsers now, they give you that opportunity to block the cookies. So to get around that, you're seeing this trend towards super cookies, and it's been really pretty hot in the news lately since web browsers like Chrome and Mozilla are trying to get in there and figure out a way to block these super cookies.
Yeah, and it's part of an ever evolving arms race. Like I mentioned previously, Verizon had their stint with it. I mean, Lenovo did with their Superfish Men in the Middle certificate stuff. And ultimately, I think Verizon got like a $1.3 million fine or something for it. They had been operating it for about 3.5 years. So if you break it down, 3.5 years, 1.3 million, it's about 380,000 a year in quote unquote operating expenses. So I figure if they're making more than 380K a year from the data that they're mining from that, they're just going to continue to do it because it's still ultimately profitable.
So let's tell the audience how these super cookies work. And for a lot of folks, you're probably used to having a bunch of tabs open in your web browser when you surf, and you have these little icons that are attached to the names of the different sites that you visit. And they're called favicons. And I love that name, by the way. And if you're Cookie Monster and you're out there, today's super cookie story is really brought to you by Cookie. It's brought to you by these favicons. How do they work for us?
Yeah, so when you make a request to a website, you request this favicon. and it gets stored on your machine in a cache. Typically, these types of files aren't isolated in any way, so you could request this file across different domains, and if what they do is it's similar to like a timing attack. So if your machine already has this favicon cached, it's not going to request it because its presence is, it's already on your machine. So it then becomes trackable based on the requests that are made or the lack of requests. They're able to identify who already has that favicon cached or not. So it's pretty nefarious stuff.
Yeah, and the whole key takeaway here is this: you have this F cache, you have these favicons stored in the F cache, and then what you have is the ability for the threat actor to potentially exploit that F cache. And on top of all that, you have advertisers, and they're working hand in hand with their ISP and the mobile providers, and what they're trying to do is they're injecting into the HTTP header and a redirect to a third-party website which receives that request. And then from there, the third-party website will direct that request back to the advertiser. So you can bypass your normal cookies with these super cookies, and it can create a whole mess out there if you're a threat actor and looking to exploit that in your environment. So it's good thing is that there's a lot of traction from the web browsers. So Chrome and Mozilla, they're all over this sucker, and you can do an update up there, and it'll try to help stop some of this nastiness. But the evolution of super cookies is fascinating. It's very creative, and I can't get enough of just trying to understand how this stuff works.
Yeah, it's like I said, this ever evolving arms race. I think Project Tor browser had implemented measures against this kind of thing about 5 years ago.
Yeah, forever.
So it's definitely been around for quite some time, and I think things are starting to evolve where privacy is becoming a lot more of a forefront of a feature. You see that with iOS and the App Store now listing out all the privacy information that an application has. So it's pretty interesting. Mozilla's had this project called Tor Uplift, where they're trying to implement all the security features from Tor into mainstream Firefox. So pretty cool to see that kind of stuff getting rolled in.
Well, Forrest, you know what time it is?
What time's that?
It's time for the breaches. Oh, I love this part of the show. I love it. I love talking about breaches, Forrest, because it never stops, and there's always a lesson learned from every breach that happens in the news. So you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So we've got a lot of news out there, and the big thing that was in the news is this hack of this chemical plant. I swear this was on every newscast in every part of the country about this chemical plant. It's not even a chemical plant; it's a water treatment plant down in Florida.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty interesting that it was very widespread. Normally, these sort of things don't really hit the news. And largely, I think ICS, industrial control system stuff, just flies largely under the radar. So it was pretty cool to see how much attention this got. I actually, my wife sent me a link to this asking if I had seen it. So it was like, those that aren't typically following this sort of stuff, it was brought to the forefront for sure.
Yeah, these SCADA systems and ICS control systems, for the audience out there, they're very difficult to try to secure. And that's because for a lot of these systems, they were developed a very long time ago before the internet really came into play. So what's happening is these treatment plants and these industrial control systems have to have the access and the controls built on top of the old systems, which then creates even more vulnerabilities. And a lot of these places, they all want to have remote access. They all want to be able to remote in and try to do the different controls. The story is fascinating because of what was released in the news and some of the details from that story. So there was actually 2 intrusion attempts. And as far as we understand it, intrusion number 1, the plant operator actually noticed for us that someone was remotely accessing the system. And the quote, I love the quote. The quote was, he didn't think much of it That's like a security awareness problem right there. Like, oh, I think we need to put this guy through security awareness training. But then number two happened, and intrusion number two was much longer. It was something like 5 minutes long, and the plant operator noticed that the mouse was moving around, and what was happening was the hacker was going through the various control functions and trying to adjust control functions. And lo and behold, Forrest, he was actually able to do something.
Yeah. From what I was reading, they were attempting to release, was it sodium hydroxide?
Yes, that's it.
Is that, yeah, that's lye. Yeah. So, typically I think the setting was supposed to be 100 parts per million. And, this dude turned it up to 11,100 parts per million. So, yeah, just a couple orders of magnitude more.
Yeah. Now, if you're not familiar with sodium hydroxide, it's also used in liquid Drano. So if you get that high enough, you could do some serious damage to your population. Now, what's interesting though is the lessons learned. And in every breach, there's always really awesome lessons learned. And in this case, we have a lot of security awareness training is a clear lesson learned, but it goes much deeper than that. You know, if an employee sees something and it looks wrong, they've got to speak up. They've got to say something. And on top of all that, there has to be multiple system redundancies in place. These ICS control systems, you know, we mentioned they're very difficult to try to secure because you're bolting security on after the fact. So one-way diodes are very helpful in these types of industrial control systems. But again, you know, for the audience, why is this so important? Well, industrial control systems, we're not just talking about water treatment plants. We're talking about your air control systems, we're talking about your elevators, escalators, all that stuff gets wrapped up in ICS controls, and it's mission critical that that infrastructure doesn't go down for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that is, driven by this. I think a lot of things like power grid infrastructure are going to start getting a lot more scrutinization. Yeah, these water plants, all kinds of stuff. Another thing that really jumped out to me was how much fail there was in this story. I read a follow up on it just I believe yesterday. There was a lot happening there. So they apparently were using TeamViewer for the remote access, but apparently they hadn't used TeamViewer in 6 months. So they had actually replaced it with Chrome Remote Desktop for their remote access for it. So that's interesting that they had changed to a different remote access broker, but hadn't removed TeamViewer. That was still in place. So yeah, a little bit of a fail there. Another line that I read said that it was, quote, appeared to be connected directly to the internet without any type of firewall protection installed. So ouch. There were a couple other things. TeamViewer was using a shared password for all the systems, and they were also running it on an outdated version of Windows 7. So no longer supported end-of-life software. So just the layers of fail it goes deep, and it's the layers that we want to see are the defense in depth.
Right, and it wasn't there. I have to laugh, Forrest, that a tweet came out, and we'll put it up on the screen here in just a moment. Sodium hydroxide _ potato tweeted out, $5 says exposed RDP or unauthorized VNC as the initial access point. So you can only look at these stories and go, I'm so glad that nobody died. I'm so glad this situation could have turned out much worse. But gosh, I mean, these systems, you can't have that kind of failure and all of these breaches with industrial control systems.
Yeah, I think a lot of the security researchers that have been screaming about this stuff for years are finally going to start getting some attention paid to them, and it's sad that it took a very near miss for that to be the case. But now people are starting to realize this could go very wrong very quickly.
Yeah. So, Forrest, in the news, also 60 Minutes had an interview with someone from Microsoft. They're talking about the SolarWinds attack, and this story has been really lighting up the headlines. 1,000 developers involved, and 1,000 developers involved in the SolarWinds breach, working on rewriting the code for this massive attack that we saw. That's a huge number. I don't think I've ever heard of 1,000 people working on a breach.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy the sense of scale there. Another interesting figure from that same interview was the number of engineers that Microsoft had actually assigned to dig in and do incident response and all that on the SolarWinds stuff. They said they had 500 engineers that were working on the getting to the root cause of all this sort of stuff. So that's a pretty massive coordinated effort on their part as well.
Yeah. The breach continues, the investigations continue, the fallout continues, but I have to say, we're never late to the party, us folks in the cybersecurity industry. NIST actually released a report outlining supply chain risk management best practices. It's like we should have maybe had that like 10 years ago, Forrest. I don't know. Maybe we're a little late to the party on that one. And then MITRE put out a report proposing a software supply chain framework, which again, it seems like a no-brainer, but when it comes to these types of attacks, lessons learned, what can we learn from it? How can we improve our supply chain? These things have to happen. And thankfully, NIST is on it, MITRE's on it. So good stuff on there.
Yeah, this whole situation it really stinks, and it reminds me of the things that I hate about infosec. There's a bunch of different ways that somebody could try and mitigate this sort of threat. There's a lot of these are going to be closed source products, so they don't want to expose their code for auditing. So you have to trust in the security of their build process. Open source software does have the advantage of being auditable and also reproducible builds. You pull the code, compile it, make sure that the binary comes out the same as what's being provided. Unfortunately, you don't have that with closed source software, but then again, that also depends on you actually going through and auditing the code. How many people are actually going through and looking at git commits and diffing it out and all that. There was a talk by Ken Thompson back in the 80s. I think it actually got a Turing Award. It's called Reflections on Trusting Trust, where Ken Thompson built a C compiler that would backdoor any code that it compiled.
Right.
And did it in such a way where it could then compile a compiler that was backdoored that you wouldn't be able to tell. And so it's just turtles all the way down. Me and one of my pen test buddies always have this joke that we're just going to quit InfoSec someday. He says he's going to be a shepherd. I'm going to go be a potato farmer.
That's awesome, man. That's great. How's your French, Forrest? How's your French?
Parlays vous francaise non.
Je m'appelle Heff. We got to talk about France for a moment because they just suffered a huge SolarWinds style cyber attack. It's very similar to the attack that just happened in the United States. The French government agencies were hit. A lot of industry was hit. The report actually came out from the French cybersecurity agency, and I'm going to butcher saying this, but I want to do it because I want to practice my French with all of you in the audience. Agency Nationale de la Sécurité Système d'Information. It's probably the worst French you've all ever heard, right? But that's the French cybersecurity agency, and what they're implying is this Russian APT. Potentially, it's a Russian military group known as Sandworm. Some of us know it as Unit 74455. And what's interesting is the threat actor went after a system called Centrion Systems, which is a French IT firm. And what they specialize in is network and monitoring systems, very similar to what SolarWinds does. A lot of this Centrion stuff was used by the French Air Force. A lot of government agencies in France use it, and they were targeted.
Yeah, what was interesting is, kind of similar targeting where they're going after, these monitoring and administrative kind of systems for the infrastructure. What really stood out to me was apparently the software that got targeted was actually running from 2014. It was an open source version that hadn't been supported in over 5 years. So, man, talk about
low hanging fruit. Low hanging fruit, right there.
Exactly.
We don't know from the news how the initial compromise happened. When we talk about that cyber kill chain, the initial compromise, we're not 100% sure on how that happened. We do understand that they used a lot of malicious scripts. So we're talking web shells to try to remotely hijack the websites and the control systems in this France attack. So we'll keep on the news, and if it's an update, we'll give you the update. We also have to talk about a breach from Excellion, and I'm familiar with Excellion. I've used it in my past life a lot of different places. So Excellion, the breach with Excellion continues. I don't know how many times, Forrest, you have to tell clients and you have to tell companies, hey, when the vendor puts out a notice that this is reaching end of life and we're no longer going to support this particular product line, you've got to take action.
I thought that this one was pretty interesting. The Jones Day breach. Apparently, the attacker said that Excellion wasn't the source of the attack, but instead that they actually hacked their server directly. So, I mean, hard to say. I mean, credibility is kind of goes out the window when you're hacking people. So, who's going to take you at your word? But it's possible. It may also have been Excellion that was the root. Who knows? But I also thought that it was interesting that Excellion software, the file transfer software, wasn't yet end of life. It was nearing end of life, but it technically still should have been supported as far as security patches and things like that go. So it makes me wonder, since they had announced an end of life, how much are they actually devoting to supporting that and maintaining it and seeing it through to the end.
Yeah, it just seems like every day we're hearing a different company that was potentially targeted because of Excellion. I know that Jones Day announced there was some news about Jones Day. It's a law firm. They were heavily involved representing Donald Trump for a while. So some of that data was involved in this, and it's being sold right now on the dark web. We also know that a company called Singtel had a third-party breach, and they're saying it's part of the Excellion FTA. So the news continues on this breach, and again, we'll stay on top of it too. And we've included the links if you want to learn more about Excellion. A couple other things going on too is Brazil. We never want to leave out other countries. And Brazil, man, Forrest, this is a country, it's like the Wild Wild West down there in Brazil. They had that breach last year. 223 million Brazilians' data was leaked. And then on top of all that, this past week, Brazilian authorities released another breach of 102 million consumers exposed. And this one was specifically tied to the mobile phone, the telcos down there, a company called Vivo and a company called Claro. 102 million mobile phones, Forrest, were in this breach.
Yeah, it's brutal. You just hear one after another from Brazil. It sounds like things are pretty hectic, and it does sound like they're trying to take some measures to curtail this sort of stuff. So they actually implemented their national data protection authority. I don't know what the Portuguese name for it is, but they actually just formed last October, from what I was reading, and apparently it got off to a pretty rough start. So it was initially proposed, and then it got vetoed by government officials based on the argument that only the executive branch has the power to create new government organizations. So then they did bring it back some months later, but under the condition that it wouldn't incur any additional spending. Which I'm not sure how you run a data protection agency without spending any money. I mean, you're gonna have to get pretty creative with your accounting there.
That's something else. All we need is duct tape and barbed wire, and we'll have a cybersecurity agency, right? This particular story, Forrest, it was discovered. This leak was discovered back in February 3rd. And as we understand it, Vivo and Claro, the mobile operators, they actually initially denied it, which is like the worst thing to do. Don't deny it. Just say, you know what, we're going to investigate and we're going to have a follow-up to this story. But instead, they just flat out denied that it happened, which is awful, awful thing to do. So we do know that the data from these 102 mobile phones was released for sale on the dark web. It included names, taxpayer information, minutes spent on the phone call. So interesting stuff. And again, this breach just, again, blows my mind that it keeps happening, all these breaches down in Brazil.
Yeah, I certainly hope that things can start coming together down there, because it sounds like it's in rough shape.
So, out of all of these telco breaches, and it's not just the folks in Brazil. If you guys recall in the news, it's been about, I think I want to say, Forrest, about 4 times that T-Mobile has had breaches in the last 2-3 years now. I mean, that stuff catches the eye of government agencies. And the FCC this past week, former Chairman Wheeler says that the FCC is the only agency with requisite authority to lead on network security. And I'm thinking to myself, Forrest, how come you didn't say this like 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago when, the mobile stuff was just coming into play? Why are we just now saying that, It's like FCC is really putting in the long hours for us. They're really doing it now.
It's pretty interesting to me that he writes this piece stating that it should be the FCC, whereas I'm wondering how much of this is like jurisdictional, like how it seems like there's a potential for a lot of possible infighting across the different organizations. I mean, if this is now considered like a national security issue, you would think like DoD, NSA. Or then you have other agencies like CISA, cybersecurity and infrastructure. Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of potential for stepping on toes and really figuring out who should have ownership of that overall ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm always curious to see how this stuff turns out. There's so many people with their hands in the cookie jar, Forrest, at these different government agencies, and they have noble purposes, but sometimes the execution is what always doesn't go as planned. But Forrest, let's take a moment here. We got to put up an image on the screen of Cyberpunk Forrest. I laughed so hard when I saw this for the video game Cyberpunk. This guy looks like you, Forrest.
I just need to get really jacked, a bunch of augmentations and some gauges, and I will be ready to fight some baddies.
Well, the Cyberpunk video game, they've not had it easy. And what I mean by that is it came out, I think, in December, this video game, Cyberpunk, and it had a bunch of flaws. It wasn't running properly. People were really upset. They wanted their money back from this video game. And then I think we mentioned in the last episode how Cyberpunk got breached and they were being held for ransom. And Cyberpunk said, the developers of Cyberpunk said, we're not gonna pay this ransom. Are you guys nuts? We're not gonna pay this. Well, the company that makes the video game Cyberpunk is called CD Projekt Red. Anyway, their source code was put up for sale for millions of bucks on the dark web just this past week. But the story is very unique in that you have a company that doesn't want to pay the ransom. So the auction was supposed to go for about 48 hours to buy the source code to a bunch of video games, not just Cyberpunk. And what we don't know is how the auction actually ended, because the criminals, the cyber criminals, said, we received an offer outside of the forum. It satisfied us. We're pulling down the auction. And there's a unique, another way of looking at it for us. And that is, there's another potential scenario that came into play. And that is, there may not be any buyer whatsoever. And that closing the auction was just a means for the cyber criminals to save face and, failing, because they failed to monetize the attack and the folks at CD Projekt Red didn't pay the ransom. Yeah, hey, you know what? We're just going to pull the auction down.
Yeah, fake it till you make it. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot to try and unpack in this one. I'm as I was reading through it and just kind of thinking through possible scenarios. First off, it was a pretty steep price. I think it was like bidding started at 1 million USD in Bitcoin, and they had a buy it now price for $7 million. That's a pretty hefty price tag. I mean, the only people that I think that would have that kind of money would potentially be their competitors, right? But I would imagine if you're one of their competitors, you don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, because corporate espionage exists, but on the other hand, you'd be encouraging these attacks, right? So going forward, you've then funded the market for other attacks that could then be coming after you next if you're one of their competitors. It seems like it would be a potential legal nightmare if that were ever to come to light. I mean, it just seems like it would be too hot to handle. I mean, you look at for instance, like the Half-Life 2 source code leak back in like 2003. That dude ended up getting busted. So maybe they learned a lesson and decided to just bow out. Maybe not. I don't know. Um, then you have other video game links that weren't financially motivated, like the Nintendo leaks last year. They were just dumped en masse. Are these source code leaks actually profitable? I don't know that we have that precedent set out.
Yeah. And it complicates the whole ransomware market has just changed so much in the last year to 2 years. And especially now when you have the FTC and all these government agencies saying you're not allowed to pay ransomware. And not only that, but you can't hire a third party to come in and help negotiate paying the ransom either. So that complicates it. And then on top of all that, you have just a mess with trying to figure out how are you actually going to pay this. A lot of these companies have no means and have no policies or processes in place. When the threat actor says you're going to pay me in Bitcoin, they're sitting there holding their hands going, how do we do that? We don't have the mechanism. Believe it or not, a lot of these companies don't have the mechanisms to actually even pay the Bitcoin, even if they wanted to. So it's a mess. It's an absolute mess in the ransomware market. But we'll keep an eye on this story. It's fascinating the way it plays out. Again, a lot of lessons learned here. So, Forrest, I think we're going to wrap today's show up. We're going to wrap the presentation up talking about ways to protect your privacy. I know we get a lot of questions about these devices like Amazon Alexa, the Google stuff, those Google Home Minis, the Apple HomePod, and Siri and Alexa, and all those names. For a lot of people, they're concerned what's actually happening with those voice assistants. So we're going to kind of wrap up today's show giving you a little primer on how to protect yourself from some of these devices in your home.
Yeah. There's a lot of concern with. I mean, I personally don't have any of these home assistant devices. I'm not particularly comfortable with having an internet connected microphone just hanging out. So that's just my personal preference, though.
Well, a lot of questions come up. I get the kind of questions, Heff, what are they recording? What are they actually? I mean, I know they're listening. How do they know? They put up these ads. I was just talking with my wife about pizza, and they put up this ad about pizza on my phone, right? A lot of those activities, if depending on where you source your information from, what you'll find from some of these devices, activities are recorded. They're likely heard by somebody at Google. However, there's a caveat, and the caveat is the information that's being extracted from those recordings is not tied to anyone's Google account or device. And what you'll find is a team of Google employees are just simply reviewing the keywords to improve the effectiveness of Google Assistant, for example. So depending on where you read, well, are they just doing that to help improve the product, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, it's hard to say, and it's a lot of this stuff isn't really openly verifiable. There's a lot of trust that's going on where we have to take them for their word, and until it's proven otherwise, we basically just have to operate off of privacy policies or terms of use or things like that. So, I mean, there are some open source voice assistants out there, things like Mycroft, Open Assistant, what have you. But I mean, then again, they also don't have the same budget as some of these, trillion-dollar corporations. So I don't think the user experience is going to be quite there, and potentially they could also have some security issues of their own. So it's kind of just a mire that I'm hoping to avoid entirely.
I don't blame you at all. The thing about these devices, depending on what privacy policy you read, if, for example, you can delete the history of Apple in these devices, but what Apple will tell you is the data is actually sampled. So that's just another fancy way of saying, yeah, it's recorded. It is. Apple would also tell you that it's sent to the servers. The data is not associated with an iPhone. So similar statement that you would get from Google, you also get from Apple. And we thought what we would do is help help you in the audience understand how to delete your history. So let's take a quick moment to explain that and understand that. Google says the recordings are saved in your Google account, and you can actually find that account. You can review it, and you do that by going to your Google account. You choose data and personalization, then you choose my activity. From there, you can actually filter through and you can select assistant. You might see when you get into that folder and you see what is there, you may see several recordings, and some of those recordings may say unknown voice command. From there, what you'll have to understand is that when you see unknown voice command, these are typically incidents where Google thought you said, "Hey Google." Did my Google thing go off? No, not yet. But you won't actually be able to see or hear what was actually in the recording. So if you have an Amazon Echo, you can actually see and hear what's been recorded. You can use the Alexa app, and then you can do that on an iPhone or an Android device. And from there, you can select the More tab, then choose Activity, and finally Voice History to see what's in there, and you can delete. From there, we need to talk about the Apple stuff. And if you're on an iOS device, Siri actually only listens for the wake word. And the wake word, if you have it, is listen for Siri, and that's turned on. So you can go to your iPhone settings, you can select Siri and search, and what you can do is turn off listen for Siri, and that way you don't have to press, you'll have to actually press a button then if you want to ask for her help. Is Siri a her? She must be a her, right, Forrest?
I believe that's the default. I think you can customize. If I remember rightly, my wife has the English Siri. Yeah, it's interesting.
my wife has the British guy because she loves Cumberbatch Bach or whatever his name is, that the actor that played Sherlock and Doctor Strange. Anyway, you can delete all of Siri's dictation history. You can do that in those settings. And you got to remember, though, again, if you delete the history, Apple will tell you that, some of that stuff was sampled and it was sent to their servers. And again, it's all being done to potentially, allegedly improve the product, right? So we hope it helps you, and we're glad you tuned in on this piece, because it's important that you protect your privacy and you understand how these voice assistant devices work. All right, and on that note, we're going to wrap up today's show. We want to just remind everyone that the new Malwarebytes Lab report came out for 2021, and we'll talk about that on next week's episode. But we're always glad you joined us. I hope you like it. We always have a lot of fun. I know we have tons of fun talking about this stuff with you. If we get enough likes, 5,000 likes, 5,000 subscribers, I will whip out my Chris Farley impersonation for you, and it's going to be a doozy. And on that note, Forrest, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again next time.
Yeah, take care, folks.